Buenos días. I'm going to do the introduction in English because the talk is going to be in English. I'm still Juan Luis Suarez, like yesterday, director of the Cultureplex Lab at Western University. And it's my privilege and honor to introduce you to Andrew Chunilall, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Community Foundations of Canada, the umbrella organization that brings together all the community foundations across the country. He joined this organization in 2013, and in 2017 he became the CEO after several years of service as Vice President of Finance at the London Community Foundation, which is the town in which Western University sits. His expertise has to do with finance and regulatory matters related to philanthropic enterprises, and he has devoted himself as leader of the Community Foundations of Canada with the task of transforming and innovating in this very important sector for the society of the country. What's the capacity to lead, the capacity in terms of power of these organizations to transform the country, to align the priorities with social objectives at a global level, like the Sustainable Development Goals, have been some of the projects in which Andrew has been involved. I think his perspective is going to be very interesting in two levels. The Community Foundations of Canada and all the philanthropic world plays a very important terms in terms of cohesion and social transformation in the country. The question is how valuable and in what terms these organizations are going to be valuable in the 21st century, especially in a country like Canada with a lot of immigration and with a social fabric that is changing radically from the fabric that gave birth to Confederation almost over a century ago. How do these organizations look like in that transformed and global Canada? And the second one has to do with his interest in culture and cultural leadership as a skill in the global 21st century. I think he has been doing a very interesting work in several countries around this idea, and I think his perspective will put him into value a side of culture that we are not so used to seeing in the developing programs of very important countries around the world. So please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Thank you, Juan Luis. Thanks for that kind introduction, and I just want to recognize the conference organizers for their gracious invitation to speak here today. It's uncommon that I would speak or have the privilege to speak in an academically influenced environment, and I'm not a professor or a researcher, but I do work with a large group of community foundations across the second largest country in the world in terms of geography. And one of the challenges that we have that Juan Luis talked about is how do we stay relevant in the context of a country that's changing so quickly? And given that I'm outside of Canada, I think I might maybe lay out some of the challenges or some of the changes that Canada is dealing with that I think are somewhat unique in the global context. Canada has about 37 million people, and surprisingly, we're one of the most urbanized countries in the world. Almost 80% of our population lives in a highly urbanized area. And just to put that into context, the urbanization rate for the world, so for the globe, is about 50%. So we're well above the average. The interesting thing on the demographic side, and most of you, or some of you will know that Canada has its culture and its heritage rooted in an English and French culture, Anglophone and Francophone. And that in and of itself is starting to change very quickly. And what I mean by that is, of the 36 million people that we have, it's the first time in Canadian history where those over the age of 55 well outnumber those under the age of 35. And we have a life expectancy for both men and women that are around 80 years of age. And we also have one of the lowest birth rates in the world. The birth rate in Canada is 1.7 per couple. And the interesting thing about that is we clearly don't even replace ourselves. So when you have a country that's aged and that doesn't replace itself through birth, the only way to even maintain population neutrality, let alone growth, is through immigration. So I mentioned that the culture of Canada is changing. There was a time in the post-World War II environment where most of our immigrants were coming from, I'll categorize them as two places. One is European countries, and the second is Commonwealth countries. And so, although when my parents immigrated in 1974, they came from British Guiana, and so the immigration has been relatively diverse, but now immigration is coming from a much more expansive part of the global south, Middle East as well, India and China. And our new immigrants have a vastly different outlook and orientation to our country than the immigration that we had in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So this in and of itself is creating change. So we have a lot of people that will in effect die in the next 15 to 20 years as a consequence of mortality, and they'll be replaced by people who are vastly different. So we are experiencing robust, accelerated cultural change, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk to you specifically about two concepts. One is belonging, and the second is culture. In my personal opinion, I think belonging has become one of our most significant social challenges in Canada, for the reasons that I cited. I think belonging is also becoming a critical challenge in different parts of the world as well. We don't, as North Americans or as Canadians, we don't have to look far to places like the UK, Brexit, or a Trump America to determine that belonging and the sense of belonging and connectivity to your community is a challenge. I want to explore how some of these shifts, the shifts that what I call are subordinate to globalization, is causing people to feel disconnected to what they once knew. More directly, how globalization is changing culture and causing people to feel less connected not only to their community, but in some cases to their family. We see the consequences all over the world. They show up as populism, nativism. We see protectionism by governments. We even experience racism. In fact, there's too many isms to list. So what precisely is happening? What is happening not just in Canada, but in the world, and things that you would experience? I'll highlight three. In general, communities are wrestling with a massive amount of human migration. The 2017 International Migration Report suggests that 260 million people in the world reside in a country that is not the country that they were born in. This represents over 50% increase since the year 2000. The second is technology, and I know that some of the speakers this morning talked about technology and talked about the Internet of Things. The World Economic Forum releases the Global Risks Report. You may be familiar with it. And the 2017 report suggested that there are roughly 8.4 billion devices in the Internet of Things, in the IoT. And you think about that against the global population, which is roughly 7.5 billion, maybe a little higher. That indicates that each one of us has at least one device. That same report suggests, and we're tracking towards this, suggests that by the year 2020, which is only a few months away, that we will have 20.4 billion devices in the Internet of Things. And so each one of us is likely to have 3 devices. I know I've got my watch, which is a device, and I have my phone here, and my computer might be a part of that as well. And I'm sure many of you would say that you've got the same number of devices. But having these many devices has caused us to become hyper-connected to news and information, not just in our communities, not just in our country, but all around the world. Our people, our global citizens, know more about the world now than we've ever known before. Information is everywhere as a consequence of technology. The third big shift that I'll talk to is climate change. We were just out on the front lawn having some coffee, and we were talking about climate change. The World Economic Forum suggests that 2/3 of the world, 2/3 of the globe, will live in a city by the year 2050. I mentioned that the global urbanization rate is 50%, so by 2050 it'll be almost 70%. This will place almost 1 billion people residing in cities that are located on a coastal area. That same report suggests that if we have a half a meter, it's probably about this much, increase in sea levels, that those 1 billion people that reside in cities at the coastal regions will be at risk. So if you think about urban infrastructure, it would include roads, railways, airports, ports, telecommunication infrastructure, sanitary facilities, clean drinking water facilities. All of those things are subject to massive degradation as a consequence of rising sea levels. So, these global forces such as human migration, technology, and climate change, they require a coordinated and sustained global cooperation from many countries and many different nations. And countries and nations themselves are different. They are unique. They have different cultures, languages, values, priorities, and interests. And we are now asking them to come together and work on common issues. The Paris Agreement is a good example of this collaboration. And like many of the challenges in the world today, there are typically 2 components to a challenge. One is the technical side, and typically a technical problem will have a technical solution. And in this day and age, a technical solution can take the form of a policy change, a new law, a regulatory change, perhaps innovations even in technology. The other part of a problem is the cultural side of it. So you have a cultural problem, requires a cultural solution. And a cultural solution is about changing behaviors. It's about changing mindsets or shifting existing mindsets. In many developed nations, and Canada including, They typically have robust infrastructure. What makes them a developed nation. They have stable governments, social safety nets, a sizable, strong, healthy middle class. And in these developed nations, what is happening is that the culture is changing. And it's not just in Canada, it's in many other countries as well. It's changing because of the influx of new migrants. It's changing because there's a generation that's literally born with a smartphone in their hand and have access to all that information that we talked about. And there's a movement of conscientious citizens with a keen focus to protect the environment ahead of profits and capitalization. That is a fundamental change. All of these things have created cultural change, which brings us to the cultural tension that we feel. It can be between generations. You may have sit down, some of you will have children, some of you have parents. When you sit down and have dinner and talk about things, do you feel cultural intelligence or intergenerational tensions? Your outlooks are different than theirs. Well, this is happening at scale. There's tension between genders, between men and women. There's tension that exists between the political ideologues. In any country, it's palpable. And at this point, we have not quite developed the cultural fortitude or resilience to handle the tensions between the old world and the new world. The outcome is we are experiencing less connectivity, or our communities, we're experiencing less connectivity, but at the same time we are feeling less connected as human beings. I mentioned we have 3 devices per person, yet we've never been lonelier. It's an interesting paradox, and one that has to be explored. So it brings me to this idea, this sense of belonging. I said I was going to talk about belonging. And I think belonging is the most important currency in the 21st century. In part because I think belonging can help bridge divides and help alleviate some of these cultural challenges that are associated with human migration, the proliferation of technology, or the degradation of the climate. So let's explore this further. So first off, what is belonging? Let's answer that question. There's many definitions to belonging. If you run a Google search, you'll come up with a few. So I'll try to encapsulate those into one cohesive definition. Belonging is being part of the collective we. It's this sense that we can fit into the whole, that we want to be part of something that's greater than ourselves. And it's also about the thing that we're fitting into. It could be a place or a group. It's about the place and group's ability to welcome and include us. So belonging is a two-way street. It's about yourself, but it's also about the place and the group that you're trying to belong to. And both have responsibilities. Well, why is belonging important to us? Well, researchers say that belonging is as fundamental to humanity as food, water, and shelter. And that's backed up by data. But also, connected and caring communities keep people well. If you feel like you belong to a community, and that community makes you feel valued and respected, you're more likely to be a healthy human being. In fact, research shows that our connections to others and the strength of those relationships makes us less likely to suffer from poor health. Strong social networks encourage engagement to community and a willingness to take action. Each and every one of us has a story of belonging. And what I mean by that, we all have a story of what it feels like to belong. It can be that belonging to our family, our parents, our children, our grandparents. Immediately you walk into that room and you feel like you belong there. You're connected through blood and heritage and identity. But we also have stories of when we feel or sense like we don't belong. Perhaps you've moved to a new community or a new country. Perhaps you started a new job or went to a new school. And on those first days, you don't know anybody. You're not connected. And so you might feel for a short period of time that you don't belong until you start to develop the relationships and connections. So belonging is universal, irrespective of race, religion, or creed. And it's a basic human need. Oftentimes I find value in storytelling, so I'm going to convey to you a personal story. And it's the first story that I can remember about my personal relationship with belonging. But let me provide a little contextual information first. I think I mentioned that my parents immigrated to Canada, and they immigrated to Canada in 1973 from a country called British Guyana. It was called British Guyana at the time, but now it's just called Guyana. And it's located in South America. My ancestors are of East Indian descent. And the British in the early 1800s came upon this very small area in South America. And this was the age of discovery. And they discovered this land, and it had lots of sugar. And you think about in the early 1800s, sugar would have been an extremely important commodity. And the British wanted to cultivate it, grow it, and then ship it out to the rest of the world. It was highly profitable. But they didn't have anybody in Guyana to work in the harsh conditions of that country to grow and cultivate and export sugar. At the time, the Queen of England had outlawed slavery. And they looked at the outcomes of slavery and they said, we can't have that. That's not a good way to go about building enterprises. And so they created a derivative of slavery, which is called Indentured Servitude. And they went to India, and they were able to convince Indians to get on these boats and sail across to the other side of the world, to the West Indies, in this case Guyana, and to cultivate sugar. And so my ancestors got on those boats, and they ended up in another part of the world. So the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, which was Pierre Trudeau, so our existing Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau, so this would have been his father, decided that he was going to open up the doors of immigration. And an influx of immigrants came in the early 70s. My parents were one of them. And they arrived in a small city called London, Ontario, which is where both of us live and work. And London, Ontario in 1973 was probably the least diverse place you would ever find. But that is where my parents settled. And I spent, much like most of you, the first 5 years of my life in a close quarters. I was raised by my parents and uncles and aunts and cousins. And I only knew really one culture, and that was the culture of my family. I didn't do a lot of extracurricular because money was scarce and survival was the imperative. Until 1979, when I was 5 years old, and it was my first year in school. And the first year of school in Canada, we call it kindergarten. I don't know what it's called here, but it's just before grade 1. And my mom walked me to school that morning in September, and I remember this. And in part because I was nervous, I was a little bit scared of what this school business was all about. And my mom put me in the lineup with all the other 5-year-old kids to go into the school, and she saw that I was nervous, and she gave me a kiss and a hug and reassured me, and she left. And the bell rang, and all the kids went into the school. And we walked in a single file line through some hallways and into the classroom, and it was kindergarten, so there's no chairs and desks. You sit on the floor. And the teacher came in, and she was a very nice lady. Big smile, very warm demeanor, And she came in and introduced herself, and I immediately felt at ease. I thought this was great. And she also had a clipboard with a piece of paper that had all of our names on it. And she started taking attendance. And so she went down the list, Jennifer, Lisa, Mark, Bill, John, and she got to a point on the list where she paused. And it seemed like she paused for minutes, but it was seconds, and I knew that she had come to my name. Now, my name's not actually Andrew. That's the name that I go by. But my real name is Surendra. So on that list, it would have said Surendra Chunilall. This is 1979 in Canada. And so that name wasn't rolling off the lips of a lot of people. So she attempted to say my name. I helped her out because I realized she was struggling. And I remember that moment because I had three feelings that I now, as an adult, I'm in touch with. Number one is I felt a bit awkward. Number two, I was slightly embarrassed because I'm a bit of an introvert, so I didn't like the extra attention. And three, it was the first time in my life, at 5 years old, I realized I was different. All the other kids around me were white. Don't forget, I was raised by my family. I was only 5 years old, and I realized I was different. So, as the weeks and the months went by, I developed some good relationships. I was having a great time in kindergarten, and all the kids were great. But there was a problem. None of them could say my name correctly. The Bills and the Johns and the Marks couldn't quite say Surendra. So, what did kids do? Well, they just give you a new name, right? We all went to school, you get a nickname, right? It's not your real name. So they renamed me Andrew. I still have that name today. My wife calls me Andrew. My kids know me as Andrew. It doesn't appear on a birth certificate, or on a passport, or a driver's license. I think the only people that call me Surendra are my parents. So speaking of my parents, at some point they got wind that I was going by a completely different name. And think about it. If you're a parent and your child decided, your oldest son decided he's going to go by a completely different name, you'd probably be upset. Most people would be. I'm a parent, I would be upset. I spent a lot of time on my children's names. Well, they sat me down and they asked me what was going on. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it would have probably been like, hey, Mom, Dad, the kids can't say my name. And I'm going with this other name because it helps me to feel like I'm part of the group now. And it's easier to be accepted when your name is like the other names. My parents didn't put up any resistance. They said, go for it. I was surprised. As an adult, I'm surprised that they did that. But I think back and I realized that they were immigrants 5 years into a country. They themselves had different names. They dressed differently. They ate different food. They spoke differently. They themselves were trying to fit in. They were trying to fit in. They were trying to belong to Canada. And they probably thought, you know what, our son doesn't need this obstacle of his name. Let him go by the name he wants to go by. Let's talk about belonging a little bit more, because belonging, as I mentioned, has this assertion or precursor that you need to fit in. You need to feel like you're fitting in to belong. Has anybody in the room heard of Brene Brown? Oh, somebody in the back. Okay, so Brene Brown's an American. She has a Netflix special. It's called A Call to Courage. And she's written many books. She's a PhD, an academic, a professor, a researcher, and she does a lot of work on belonging. And in her Netflix special, if you have a chance to watch it, she talks about belonging, but she also talks about the opposite of belonging. Does anybody know what the opposite of belonging is? Nobody ever does. The opposite of belonging is fitting in. Let me repeat that. The opposite of belonging is fitting in. The minute you try to acclimate and change something about yourself, it can be your name, it could be your heritage, your language, and your culture. When you start to change those very important things that are core to you, you're not belonging anymore. You're fitting in, and that is the opposite of belonging. So when I decided that I was going to allow my name to be changed, I actually wasn't belonging. I was fitting in. And I think a lot of us would have those stories. We would think about things that we might have changed so that we could feel like we're part of a group or a place. So for years, we thought belonging was something people externally negotiated, much in the same way that I did, to seek a connection. As it turns out, and this is what Brené Brown says, she says, men and women who have the deepest sense of true belonging are people who have the courage to stand alone and do what they are and be who they are. They are willing to maintain their integrity and risk disconnection in order to stand up for what they believe in. That's belonging. Belonging is about yourself. It's not necessarily about connection to other people. It's about connection to yourself. So this brings me to where we are in the world. I talked a lot a bit about what's happening in the world. We seem to be more sorted now than we've ever been. And what I mean by that is we've tended to fragment ourselves into groups. We are now in the world more likely to live with, worship with, and go to school with people who are politically and ideologically like-minded. And that's already a natural human thing. You know, you tend to search out and seek people that are like you, look like you, speak like you. But the logic suggests that this fragmentation results in more people feeling a less sense of belonging. And Brené Brown says that these connections are actually counterfeit. It's not a real connection. She calls it common enemy intimacy. The only thing that we have in common is that we tend to not like the same people. That's what common enemy intimacy is. And we're becoming more lonely as a consequence. The solution is that we need to focus in on things that connect our humanity in a profound way. The things that move us farther away, faster than anything else, is not politics. It's fear. Fear is at the heart of populism, protectionism, and unilateralism. And it's fear of what? Fear of loss. Loss of what? Culture, identity, language. Fear of change. Fear of the unknown. It is this fear which will be our largest impediment in developing those cultural solutions to the cultural challenges that we face in the world. So how do we bridge this idea of belonging and fear? For all of us to experience and to really realize a sense of belonging, we must bring our authentic selves and accept others for who they are. True belonging requires the following. Curiosity. We have to be curious. We have to develop the capacity to be curious about people. Not just people who are like us, but people who are unlike us. We have to keep our ego under control. We have to be fascinated by other people. We need to stop looking at other cultures, generations, sectors, geographies, faiths, and races as merely variants of our own, where my culture is the main brand and yours is just a line extension. The second, we have to know ourselves. Ask yourself, what makes you feel superior or inferior in specific circumstances around other people. Whether conscious or unconscious, this idea of superiority translates rapidly into exchanges with people that can leave them offended or patronized. And the third is we have to learn from others. I have a quote from a colleague who's a South African colleague. And he made this quote in post-apartheid South Africa. And I'll read it. Get your head around it. Cultures are not homogeneous, but heterogeneous. There is no such thing as an African solution to an African problem. There is always a plurality of interpretations of different cultures. The differences are not a product of race, class, or any one factor. They're the result of different people facing different problems in the context of different historical challenges that weave into different cultural architectures. What he's saying is this. What makes us different isn't race. It isn't the country that we're born in. It isn't the religion or the worship. We're actually all the same at a very human level. What makes us different is all the man-made stuff. It's the history. It's the type of government that we're used to, the type of laws that we're used to following, the architectures of our community. Those are all man-made things. That is what creates the difference. So let's go back to belonging and juxtapose belonging against the need to collaborate on some of the world's most pressing issues. So often I show up at conferences like this in Canada or in different parts of the world. And coming to a conference like this takes a lot of time and energy. You have to prepare, you have to get on a flight, you have to go a long ways, you have to be away from home from your family, you have to be away from work, from your community. There's things going on. You have to balance priorities. There's money involved. There's taxis and hotels and flights and food. And so often you might ask, well, why am I here? Why are you here? Is it because you're here to learn something, to expand your mindset? Is it because it's better than being at work or in the office all day? Sometimes it's nice to come out and meet with colleagues and learn. Well, all of those things are important, and they are all reasons why we're here. But there is one overriding reason why I am here, and you may share this. I'm here because I want to belong. I want to belong to this group and what you're doing. Because this is greater than my community. This is greater than the institution that I work for, or the country that I live in, or the continent through which I reside and orient to. I really want to belong to this group. And I think that many of you might feel the same way. So, I want to just jump to the United Nations. I'm not wearing my Sustainable Development Goals pin on. I'm wearing another one. But if you're familiar with the SDGs, there are 17 goals. And they range from climate change to gender equality to economic prosperity to life on land, life below water. But there's the 17th goal. The 17th goal. Does anybody know what the 17th goal is? Partnerships. Goal 17. So all the member organizations of the United General Assembly decided to have a goal that was based on partnerships. Why? Because they knew that you can't solve the world's most pressing issues unless you have partnerships. So much so that they made it a goal. Here's the challenge. And I said it before. How do you get so many countries from all over the world, with all their different cultures and languages and interests, agendas and priorities, to build a partnership on these very important goals? So I put the question, can rapid human migration be solved with populist policies aimed at nation self-interest? Can one country tackle and solve global human migration? Can global environmental degradation resulting in warming and rising sea levels or increased carbon levels be solved by one country? Can the rapid proliferation of global technology, 3 devices per person, which leads to increased cyber attacks, privacy invasions, data breaches, be effectively solved by one country? The answer is a clear no. It requires all of us to work on these challenges together. It requires us all to have a sense of belonging. We all have to think about being global citizens, because the issues that face us now in this hyper-connected, hyper-global world are global issues. And global issues require global solutions. So we have to be global citizens. We have to embrace global belonging. Thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions.
Floor is open.
Thank you. This was a very inspiring lecture. I loved every second of it. How do you relate or connect the idea of belonging with the idea of living a meaningful life? The idea that we want to have meaning, right? And how is that meaning impacting our ecosystems right now?
Yeah, that's a deep question, and I think it's also it can be a personal question too. So I don't pretend to answer that in a universal way. I'll answer it from where it sits in my own heart. Absolutely. I think it has a lot to do with standing up for what you believe in and not fitting in. And oftentimes, and we do this as human beings, we label ourselves. You know, you can label yourself as a progressive or a liberal or a conservative or an environmentalist or an activist, and with that label comes a lot of attribution. And I think we're more complicated than that. And I think we have to show up authentically as we are, because if you're going to have meaning in life, you're going to have to stand alone sometimes, or stand against some very strong headwinds. And that's where meaning comes from. It comes from adversity. It comes from the ability to have courage. And you know, if you follow Brene Brown, you'll know that in order to be courageous, there's a precursor. And the precursor is vulnerability. You have to exercise vulnerability in order to demonstrate courage. Think about that. How can you be courageous if you're not vulnerable? It's impossible. Right? And this is my challenge with leadership in the world today, is that too many leaders don't demonstrate vulnerability. They demonstrate what they think is courage, but it's courage in playing the safe game all the time. And the status quo, at least in the context of the country that I live in, is being disrupted. People are frustrated, and they want robust, significant, bold leadership. And that requires vulnerability. And so for me personally, meaning and purpose in life comes from that.
Thank you very much. As a migrant myself, and someone who's made home somewhere else in a different language, and coming from a country that's now going through the motions of stop belonging to the European Union. I can. Sorry, I'm not making any sense. It's your presentation has been quite moving. So please allow me. It is, yes, I am here too because I want to belong. Then it's a political act of as an academic, as a migrant academic in the UK, to keep wanting to come to see my European colleagues, even though I'm an advocate of traveling less to conferences, and even though sometimes I think all of this could be done on Skype, really, and not consume so much, and not fly so much, etc. But it's important to see the people and be there. My question for you is based on that experience, right? I was just thinking in the airport in Gatwick and then in Malaga about how I become, as a Mexican, as a Mexican with a British passport that still says European Union on it, very much aware, painfully aware of minorities traveling, or visible minorities traveling, ethnic minorities traveling internationally. There seems to be a level of privilege that makes you completely blind to the barriers that other people need to overcome in order to become global. Or, what does that mean really? Because sometimes people just fly between a few points, but what my question is really, how to really be global citizens. How can we help also, or not help? I don't know what the verb is, but how can those of us who have been privileged to overcome significant barriers, to be able to be places, to see different things, to communicate in different languages, with others that need to act local, not as a choice, but because they have no choice. They think global, but they need to act locally because they have no alternative. So I think it's easy to say, we must be global citizens, but if you are, coming from Syria as a refugee to Italy, or if you are one of those people in the detention centers in the border in the US, how do we tell them we must be global citizens?
Yeah.
I know your organization works, very strongly on this. So how do you think we can take this to help more others? Sorry about the long rant.
Oh no,
Thank you.
I love the context, and I think the question is a compelling one. I'll answer it in the form of a story, as a real story. And my Canadian counterparts will be familiar with this. Our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, became the Prime Minister in 2016, I think. Is that right, Pierre? And in his election platform, he ran on many things. One of the things that he promised was that if he won, he would bring 25,000 refugees from Syria to Canada in a very short period of time, in a matter of 6 months. Population-wise, we're not a very large country. Like I said, we're only 36 million people. So in addition to our regular immigration, our Prime Minister made a commitment to bring 25,000 refugees to Canada, Syrian refugees. And not just any refugees. He wanted the most vulnerable refugees, the ones that were English was not their first language, had many children, maybe had lower skills than the rest, and he really wanted to do this from a humanitarian perspective. And so we did it. Canada did it in the matter of 6 months. And I have to tell you, there were a lot of Canadians who were asking the question, there are Canadians that don't have jobs. There are Canadians that don't have proper homes. There are Canadians that don't have access to clean drinking water. We have a healthcare issue. We have an education issue. Why would we extend ourselves to bring 25,000 people from another country to our country to further exacerbate the problem? And that's a real concern. It's actually a very logical and reasonable place to go. But what it did was it created a groundswell to answer the question that you've put on the table, which is how do we connect local and global? And if you think about where Canada is in the world, we have an ocean on the right and an ocean on the left. We have the north, which is very sparsely populated, and for most of the year you can't even travel through. And then we have our neighbors to the south in the United States. We have been insulated mostly from wars and global human migration for our entire country's history. We're 152 years old. The only country we really have to worry about is the United States. And it's not like Europe where there are so many countries in a very small area. But the world's changed. Technology, climate change, we've talked about all these things. And Canadians had to come to grips with the fact that a war on the other side of the world that had nothing to do with us, a global issue, became a local issue. Because now we had to bring 25,000 refugees to Canada, which was a drop in the bucket compared to the amount that were displaced as a consequence of that war. But it also created a sensitivity that we have to be vested in what happens in other parts of the world because it shows up right in our community. As we're bringing refugees to Canada, it shows up right in our community. I have this saying when I speak in Canada about what's going on in the world. Anytime there's geopolitical or economic instability in the world, when that goes up, the demand for Canada goes up. It's true. Anytime there are unstable economic markets in the world, much of that foreign capital comes to Canada. It can be capital from Mexico, China, India, the Middle East. In fact, that's where most of the foreign capital in Canada is coming right now. It's driving up our real estate values. So again, global problem, local consequence. As the Chinese are getting richer, our real estate values are going up. Global, local. It's an easy case to make because of so many years of globalization. We are all interconnected. One country sneezes, we get a cold. Hope that answers your question.
Thanks so much for your speech, touching me also in many different ways. So thanks so much. I was wondering, from a practical perspective, how are you bringing this idea of belonging into the communities that you serve? And also you mentioned technology, and I wonder, how do you think we can use technology to foster this sense of belonging and bring us together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on the first question, there's an education and an awareness. This is the challenge with belonging. I said it's a basic human need, and the data and the research affirms that. Well, there are other basic human needs too, right? Food, water, and shelter. Those are very tangible things. And so organizations, NGOs, governments, things that you can put your hand on and measure, those are the things we tend to focus in on. Because as human beings, we want to show something for our efforts. If we run organizations, we want to be able to measure how successful we've been. You know, how many people have you clothed? Have you fed? Have you put in a home? Those are easy things. They're tangible. The challenge with belonging is it's a sense. You can only sense belonging. It's the only way to measure it, right? You just know, like you use your heart and how you feel what you see, what you touch, those are the things that determine belonging. And because it is so intangible, we don't commit enough resources and time and effort. We don't think about it enough. And I think what we're doing right now at the Canadian level is bringing the conversation forth and trying to relate belonging to each and every person. Like I said before, everybody has a belonging story. Everybody in this room knows when they belonged and when they didn't belong. And that's the first step. Because when you evoke that memory of a time when you felt like you didn't belong, if you're normal, you would not want anybody else to feel that way. And so you'll make changes to welcome and include others so that they never have to experience unbelonging. With respect to technology, my age is going to show up, and my daughter just graduated from grade 8 2 days ago, and my wife said, let's buy her an iPhone, and I wasn't too happy about that. I didn't get a phone until I was in my 30s, and my 13-year-old daughter has a phone, and I think technology has an important role to play in connectivity, but I don't think it can replace human connectivity. The most lonely people in our country, in Canada, are people that live in urban areas, that live in big cities like Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver. The people who are most connected, or who feel like they most belong, live in the rural part of the country. They live in small towns and farming communities. Why? Because you know everybody by their first name. You meet for coffee. You meet for lunch. You hang out. You have a sense of community. And there we have people in cities. You're surrounded by people. You can't get away from them. And those are the loneliest people in our country. So I don't think technology necessarily has a direct correlation to belonging. I think it's a factor. I think we'd be mistaken to assume that it could replace a genuine human connectivity in the form of in-person relationships.
Just a very short comment before we finish. Can you elaborate a little bit about the idea of cultural intelligence and why is that an important asset to have in the world these days?
Yeah. So cultural intelligence, it builds on some old concepts. Everybody's heard the term IQ, right? So IQ is a measure of intelligence, and you can measure it. You can take a test. You can determine your IQ. In the early 1900s, people used IQ as a way to find out which individuals were going to be CEOs, run companies, be vice presidents, lead in government, and if you were smart and knowledgeable, you were on the track. In about the 1960s, another critical leadership attribute came about, and that was emotional intelligence. So that's EQ. And EQ is about being self-aware and understanding how you can have an impact on others, how your behavior or what you say can cause others to feel certain things. And so IQ and EQ were really important attributes to leadership. Well, now in this hyper-connected, globalized world that we live in, I don't know what your everyday world is like, but I know when I go to work, I have one of the most diverse workforces that you'll find. People that speak different languages, different ages, fairly gender balanced. We even have, people that don't even adhere to the male-female paradigm. They have another alternative. So you've got a very diverse workforce and a diverse country. Well, how do you lead workforces like that? Well, yeah, you do need intelligence. You do need emotional intelligence, but you also need cultural intelligence. It's a new field of study. If you're interested, there is a book on cultural intelligence. It's written by a woman in the UK called Julia Middleton. And she talks about cultural intelligence being the next biggest skill set for leaders in the 21st century. You might ask yourself how culturally intelligent is some of the politicians that we might hear from. We always talk about Donald Trump. He's we say he's the least culturally intelligent person we know. But we all need work on cultural intelligence, because none of us, there's no ending to cultural intelligence. It's a lifelong journey. And the thing is with cultural intelligence, this is I call it the CQ paradox, which is you can get some cultural intelligence through traveling, like I get some of it by coming here. You can read about other people and cultures. You might consume some of that off social media. But to get real cultural intelligence requires you to develop a relationship with another human being that has that different culture that you're trying to learn from. But in order to develop that relationship, they need to trust you. And in order for them to trust you, you need to know something about them. So that's the paradox. And that's the hard thing to figure out. But if you can and so that requires you to actually go and meet people that are very different than you, which I talked a little bit about in my remarks. But that's how you develop it. Seek out different people that share completely different values and outlooks and histories and political ideologies, and develop those relationships. You don't have to be friends, but you need to establish those relationships to extract that knowledge and to be sensitive to where they're from and what they're about.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Pleasure. Thank you.